What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And it's time for things you need to know for Pro Tour Final Fantasy, Magic the Gathering's first Universes Beyond Standard Pro Tour. And I'm super excited because the Final Fantasy set in general has not only been a very popular just IP to have, of course, in the Magic ethos, but has been a limited format that has been apparently an all-time banger, according to a lot of people. And it seems like Magic the Gathering here lately, that all the limited formats have been absolutely awesome and just kind of build on the success of the previous ones. Tell me how that makes sense. And of course, as far as like constructed Magic is concerned, Final Fantasy has provided us a lot of good role players and a lot of key cards in not only just standard, but across multiple formats of Magic. But of course, in this video, we are going to be focusing on the standard format. We're going to be looking at, how you can watch the Pro Tour, what exactly is going to be going on each of the days, and then of course, looking at the standard metagame and kind of drawing our own conclusions on what that standard metagame could look like, and of course, filling in with our own thoughts and predictions in our own Crawdaddy type of style. But before we get into any of that stuff and we talk about all things Pro Tour Final Fantasy, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where we talk mainly about the competitive formats of Magic, Modern and Standard, as well as some other longer form videos for your viewing pleasure, then please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. And if you want even more content, go ahead and check out the description down below. I have a link to my Discord server that you can join over there, as well as a link to the Casual Spikes Podcast YouTube channel, where me and my co-host Randy over at MTG with Randy talk about all things going on in the competitive sphere of Magic the Gathering. Episodes are a little bit few and far between just because our work schedules aren't really lining up all that well, but we do appreciate any and all support that you can give over there nonetheless. I also have a Twitch channel where I stream a lot of Magic the Gathering. We're actually going to be hopefully playing in a Saturday Modern Challenge at that night so definitely go ahead and follow over there and check it out, as we are going to do some light testing for the regional championships coming up in October. And lastly, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. Manatraders is a monthly subscription service to Magic the Gathering Online, where you can rent and play whatever cards you want at whatever time you want. It's absolutely amazing, not only as a content creator where I get to show off various different decks of the Modern, Standard, whatever formats I really want to play, but I also get to, in my testing, get to try out different decks and kind of see things from the other side when I'm playing a certain deck in the format. It's also kind of helped me draw conclusions on what decks I should actually build in paper to get ready for the RCQ season. So I highly recommend Manatraders. They're super fast, super simple rental service, and they're only improving their services day by day. So I do greatly appreciate them for sponsoring the channel. Now let's go ahead and get into Pro Tour Final Fantasy news and things that you need to know. So we're going to start with this article, of course, written by Rich Hagon, who I absolutely love. He did a lot of commentary way back in the, I would say, I guess really just the commentary at the beginning of the Pro Tour and stuff like that. I mean, not really the 1990s or maybe in early 2000s, but definitely someone I remember listening to through the early to mid 2010s, which, again, just an awesome personality. I had him sign one of my playmats, which is super awesome. Probably one of my favorite commentators very early on. But enough gushing about Rich Hagon. He wrote this article, of course, the viewer's guide for the Pro Tour. So of course we're going to be going over this. And if you want to kind of revisit it, read it yourself, whatever, go ahead and go in the description down below. I'll have it linked down there. But, of course, there's this preamble, what's the Pro Tour, what's at stake? Of course, $50,000 being the grand prize. I believe the top 8 players also qualify for the World Championship, which is really cool. And players are also going to be playing for points to potentially win the Player of the Year, or excuse me, the Kaibuda Player of the Year award. So definitely going to be really hard to try and win it if you are just kind of now just getting points at this point in the season. But, you never know. Crazier things have happened, but there's been a lot of good players here as of late. So the first thing, the broadcast schedule is going to start at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, which kind of tracks because, this is going to be more, I think this is the West Coast time zone here. So at least if you're on the East Coast, 11 p.m. or 11 a.m. Pacific time is just going to be 3 hours ahead. So you're going to be 2 p.m. Eastern. We're going to have draft and standard on day 1, draft and standard on day 2, and then day 3 is going to be a top 8 single elimination. As far as the limited formats are concerned, I believe it's going to be 3 rounds of draft with 5 rounds of standard constructed. Going into day 2, it's going to be the same thing, 3 rounds of draft versus 5 rounds of standard constructed for, I believe that's 16 rounds total. And of course, after that, we are going to have a cut to top 8. So the 8 best records from that event are going to qualify for the top 8. Something different that happens here than something that wouldn't happen at like your RCQ or even at the regional championship. If they get so many match points, which I believe at the top of the article said it was like 30, competitors who finish with 30 or more match points will be invited Pro Tour returns. So that's not it. I believe it's like 33 or 36 match points at a certain point in the event, just gets buys through the rest of the tournament and actually locks up that corresponding seed. So, if you have a player that's like 12-0 or 13-0, whatever the case may be, they actually just get buys throughout the rest of the day, and they're going to be the number 1 seed. And we'll kind of see that happen. This really only happens at the Pro Tour, and I think it also happens at the World Championship. But nonetheless, like, that's something to keep in mind if you are wondering, like, hey, why this player is like 11-1 or 12-1, why aren't we seeing them anymore? Well, that's going to be why, is because they actually get buys through the rest of the tournament, which is kind of a really neat concept, because then you don't have to worry about draws or potentially getting paired down, so or whatever, which, I mean, at this point, like the Pro Tour, there's a good chance you're going to make the top 8 anyway, but it just kind of stops for all that, and those players can just kind of go and move on while the other players kind of play it out. So I think that's really cool there. Of course, this is going to be streaming on YouTube and on Twitch on the official Play MTG YouTube channel, or on twitch.tv/magic. I prefer watching it on YouTube. I say this all the time in all my videos. I just like the fact that I can rewind and watch whenever I want on the YouTube stream versus Twitch. I think I found out, like, on Twitch, if you like have some kind of like subscription, like I think maybe Twitch Turbo, you're able to do it. If you want to not pay for that kind of thing, go ahead and just watch on YouTube. You're able to kind of watch at your own speed. If you have to go back, you can of course watch two times speed to kind of get caught up and everything. Personally, I enjoy it. But yeah, well, we're going to be starting at 11 a.m. Pacific time, and of course 1 p.m. Central time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, that sort of thing here in the United States. And then we kind of go down here. We have the Magic the Gathering draft archetypes here. So, of course, in a lot of the standard format, in a lot of the limited formats that we've seen from these new sets, and really kind of the standard for a lot of sets in terms of, limited, if you decide to go and draft, or maybe even play like sealed. Sealed is a little bit more kind of the Wild West, where you just kind of have to build like the best deck that you possibly can from what you've opened. But in drafting, you're kind of focusing a lot on 2-color archetypes. This is just, sometimes you're splashing like a third color that kind of gives you, it's either like a bomb, or it gives you a little bit of like a little bit of a boost. Like, it kind of loosely follows the 2-color combo that you're playing. But a lot of the times you're wanting to play like these 2-color combinations to kind of streamline your mana base. And of course, they have like the most synergy together, rather than some loose synergies here and there. So real quickly, we'll go through it. Artifacts in blue-white. You have blue-black, which is going to be control. You have red-black, which is black mage aggro. Green-red, which is landfall aggro. Green-white, which is a go-wide strategy. White-black for artifact creature sacrifice. Blue-red for big non-creatures. Green-black for graveyard value. Red-white for equipment aggro. And green-blue for town ramp. Now, exactly how do these stack up against each other? I'm not entirely sure. I've not actually gotten to play really any of this limited environment. I've just been kind of waiting to see how players feel about it, and it seems like it's very popular online and very popular to a lot of players. So definitely seems like it's worth kind of getting into if you want to try to get into a limited format. This seems like it's absolutely fantastic. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind here. But of course, probably the important thing, what a lot of people end up watching the Pro Tour for, is of course going to be standard. Now, we're going to get into the standard metagame here after we get through this article, but I'm sure that this is going to hit on a lot of things. What we're going to be kind of, I'm sure, focusing on, and this is going to be maybe some old archetypes in the format that are adding some new cards from the set, or maybe some just completely new and entirely new archetypes, which is not totally uncommon, I would say, for Pro Tours. I think that there are a lot of players that end up bringing kind of like the known quantities of the format, and they just kind of like try to test the metagame, shore up some of their bad matchups, or in the case of the metagame we're kind of seeing now, where we're seeing a lot of Is It Prowess and Mono Red aggro, and even the Azorius Omniscience deck is kind of taking a pretty big double-digit chunk of the metagame that we've seen here. So there's known quantities that show up, but there is sometimes where a testing team just absolutely breaks the format, or at least like they have a deck that kind of shows up and does decently well at the Pro Tour and then just kind of ends up taking off from there. So definitely we're going to be wanting to see potentially some big swings taken at the Pro Tour that could potentially lead to some long-term success as the kind of metagame continues to evolve past the Pro Tour. But here in the article, 60-card standard format takes center stage during the afternoon. While the Pro Tour has historically showcased shifts in the metagame over the years, many players have taken their cue from these events to define standard for the coming months. So it'll be interesting to see what holds true this time around. Because, of course, when it comes to demonstrating their prowess, that's precisely what tournament winners have been doing in droves lately, showing off their Is It Prowess decks. If you've been in standard trenches lately, names like Slickshot Show Off, Storm Chaser's Talon, Corey Steelcutter would be very familiar to you. And of course, showing off Dark Confidant and VV or Ornithir. I'm going to assume Ornithir is supposed to be the correct pronunciation of that. Of course, VV has been the most popular card probably from Final Fantasy. At least for standard purposes, there's people kind of playing around with it in Modern. It seems like it's a little slow there, at least because you want to be able to untap with it and do some like crazy busted things. But in Standard, it seems like it's okay right now. And of course, Dark Confidant is probably maybe not the best card, certainly not the best card from this set, but definitely a fan favorite and an older card that we have now seeing having a run in Standard and of course Pioneer as well, which I personally enjoy because I know that I think I've made at least 1 or 2 videos on my channel before going over some old Modern cards that I would like to see in kind of these newer Eternal formats or even in Standard as well. So it's kind of nice to see Dark Confidant here. Of course, we have the broadcast team here. We have Maria Bertholdi, we have Corey Baumeister, Ailey Loney, Marshall Sutcliffe, Paul Cheon, Cedric Phillips making a return, and Amani Devuti. I really like this broadcast team. Like, I know that I kind of glaze the broadcast team for Star City and for Magic, but these are just some really good commentators, a lot of high energy. There's just enough basic breakdown for players that maybe don't know what's going on, can totally understand it, while also being enough kind of advanced commentary for some of the players that do have an idea of kind of what's going on and maybe a little bit more of an understanding of the Standard format or just of Magic in general. So definitely some great people that they're going to have in the booth for this weekend. And of course, we're going to be getting into a lot of great competitive Magic as well. And that's going to be the end of the article. So that'll end this portion of the video. We're going to get into, we're going to go to Goldfish. We're going to talk about the Standard metagame and kind of what has shaken out over the last month, then the last few weeks, and kind of make some predictions on what we could see here as we kind of look to see what could potentially break the format, if it's going to be something that players have been playing for a while, or are we going to be shifting towards something a little bit more dramatic that is going to be taking over the Standard metagame, or potentially even taking over the Standard metagame a month or two down the road. So let's go ahead and check out that Standard metagame. So this is the Standard metagame over the last 30 days. Now, these are all results from online challenges, from various different 5.0 lists on Magic Online challenges, and some other paper events as well, but this is going to be majorly, online results and everything. And probably a surprise to nobody, we see that Is It Prowess and Mono Red Aggro are kind of dominating the top of the standings here at almost 20% each. So being about actually exactly 40% of the metagame over the course of the last 30 days. Now, this isn't shocking to anybody. Is It Prowess has been deemed the best deck in the format for quite a while here, going from this, not necessarily all in, but being a very aggressive deck that can close out games very quickly with Slickshot Show Off, to at times being built in a way where they play more of this mid-range game plan, and some of them have been going even bigger by introducing VV to the deck, and then also playing things like this town ain't big enough to kind of get some value going, and of course works very well with VV because you're able to kind of bounce more of these non-creature permanent cards, and then you're able to replay them and kind of get more value. And of course you have the loops where you can go and spend 4 mana to go pick up this town ain't big enough to then reset Storm Chaser's talent to just make more 1/1s. As we all know the story. This is kind of like what we'd see from like the Esper self balance and some of the blue black self balance decks. But Is It Prowess has kind of evolved since its initial kind of coming out party, and as still projected to probably be the most played deck at the Pro Tour and still the best deck in the format. So while this is definitely the deck that's at the top of the metagame, this is kind of the deck we're also going to be keeping an eye on of like what innovations players come up with. They're expecting the standard metagame to be 30-40% is it prowess. Like, how are they going to be building their decks to maybe beat the mirror? Maybe some players are just not going to worry about necessarily too hard on playing the mirror, and they're going to try to just make sure they can beat the rest of the metagame, because the rest of the metagame does look pretty solid here. But that's going to remain to be seen here. And of course, Mono Red Aggro ended up winning the Spotlight Series event, it was the last regional championship for Standard. And Mono Red Aggro basically has taken like a different game plan from what the other decks are doing, where the other decks are trying to slow down the Is It Prowess deck and kind of just get to a point where they can control the game. Mono Red Aggro just simply brings the game to the Is It Prowess decks by just immediately applying pressure and forcing them to interact while also trying to build out their own board, just kind of doing what Mono Red Aggro decks do, and that's just kind of forcing your opponent to have very specific answers at specific times, and if they don't or they stumble, then they're just going to be, they're going to be at 2 life, clinging on to whatever they have, and they're going to need like 3 or 4 cards to like break your board on like turn 3 or turn 4, and it's going to be very difficult to do that. So Mono Red Aggro seems to be a very popular strategy. I would not be surprised. This would be the one deck I would expect to seeing more play than Is It Prowess. And you'll see why kind of when we go to our next slide, when we look at the metagame over the last week. Azorius Omniscience, the kind of go-to combo deck, I would say, for the format here, where you're trying to get Omniscience into play, and then you have like Founding the Third Path and like these other dragons that end up bouncing multiple permanents and stuff, and you can kind of reset it, mill your opponent, whatever. Doing some crazy things. Has some very efficient removal really just kind of like tempo plays, because we see a lot of just like bouncing these cards to your opponent's hand after you kind of play a bunch of things out. It's like, okay, we'll return that to your hand. They're not going to get in their damage. They're still going to cantrip, but they're not going to get in their damage, whatever. Like, you kind of end up coming ahead, and you get to surveil, so then you end up getting to potentially set up, getting Omniscience in the graveyard while also just digging for other potential answers. Of course, the white cards are fantastic right now. Temporary Lockdown being the go-to card for a lot of these, whether they're like white mid-range decks or they're these combo decks, whatever the case may be. It's just kind of the go-to for them, on top of things like High Noon, where you can limit the amount of spells that they are trying to play. And this works, I think, especially well in some of the VV builds, where obviously they want to, play VV, and then they want to go to their turn where they cast a bunch of cantrips, they cast a bunch of spells, and then they use VV to add even more mana to do even more things, and just to kind of keep going, get in a bunch of damage with VV, all that fun stuff. And so we're going to be really focusing heavy on probably the white cards coming to this event, because it seems like, again, Temporary Lockdown, the High Noons and things like that are going to be, and of course, Authority of the Consuls as well, being a kind of like a techie card for against like the Mono Red Aggro decks more specifically, since the Is It Prowess decks are kind of leaning away from like actual physical creatures, and they're just more playing spells that just happen to make creatures. So still very good nonetheless, but definitely in the Mono Red Aggro decks, where that's kind of like their game plan. There's like they're spending mana specifically to play creatures so they can attack them. A lot of haste threats that you end up actually getting to gain a little bit of life, and of course set them back quite a bit. Just giving you a few more turns, which a lot of the times is enough against some of these Mono Red Aggro strategies. Surprisingly, Dimir midrange is back here at the beginning of the year, roughly, of 2025, and maybe into like the late stages of 2024. Dimir midrange was the best deck in the format, and this was like the go-to deck that a lot of players played. It was either this or Golgori, and then Dimir started to kind of distance itself from Golgori, and it definitely fell off in the metagame, but has now kind of come back. And this is Dimir midrange proper. This isn't, the Dimir self-bounce decks, whatever. Like, this is kind of Dimir midrange proper. You're just playing a lot of very good value, like removal spells, and a lot of good value creatures for their cost, and just trying to kind of control the game in a way, while then getting to a point where you can actually close it out. And the deck does it very nicely. We see Orzhov self-bounce, really the only self-bounce deck, it seems, from the top 10 decks of the metagame that have kind of survived. Of course, we've seen Esper, we've seen Dimir, as we just mentioned, but Orzhov seems to be the one that players have kind of gravitated towards, because, again, a lot of the white cards are fantastic. We see Unstoppable Slasher here, which is absolutely crazy. It's also just a resilient threat as well, because when it dies, it comes back with stun counters, and, if your opponent kills it when it has stun counters on it, then it goes away, but then that requires multiple spells, and a lot of these decks don't necessarily want to spend multiple spells dealing with one threat, and Slasher can also just deal chunks of your opponent's life total right away. Which is probably maybe has something to do with like 4-color Zur, or like some of these other decks that can just gain a ton of life out of nowhere. You know, the fact that even if they're up at like 40, 50, 60 life and you hit them and then they end up going to like 30 or 28 and you can slowly just kind of win games that way, is going to be pretty nice for you. But nonetheless, like the self-bounce deck, taking a little bit of a different approach where instead of just playing, Storm Chaser's Talent a bunch of times or maybe even, and they are doing this, like playing Hopeless Nightmare, whatever. The fact that a lot of your things could also just pick up temporary lockdowns, you kind of give your opponents back like their things, but you can just kind of reset the board where they're like, okay, they play another Quarry Steel Cutter, and then they end up casting a few more spells, they make a few more Monk tokens, maybe they play a Storm Chaser's Talent and whatever, then you end up just resetting your own temporary lockdown. You end up getting you give them their things back, sure, but then you end up just taking them all back and then the other permanents that they played. So it's very annoying as far as like the prowess players and some of these other aggro decks to deal with, because you don't really ever truly get a window where you're going to be able to attack with the creatures that you get back or be able to use kind of the permanents you make, because more often than not, they're going to be bouncing the temporary lockdown back to their hand and then just resetting the lock altogether. We see 4-color Zur. This was a deck that actually won Pro Tour Aether Drift and looked absolutely amazing, an insane win rate, and has just kind of slowly fallen off from here. There's some new cards. I think Yuna is like one of the new cards for Final Fantasy that has shown up in the 4-color Zur deck. Looks really cool, honestly, and kind of plays like that Zur role, except you don't have to actually activate it. So there's like some good and bad with it. But nonetheless, like 4-color Zur is a deck that I'm sure players are going to be looking at in their testing. Azorius Control and Jeskai Control being the resonant control decks of the format. Jeskai Control being more of like this Jeskai mid-range deck where you're trying to kind of get some value with like stock ups and Shikos and things like that. But Azorius Control definitely being more of the control deck, all culminating in just playing Beza, which we see from, I believe, Azorius Omniscience and Orzhov Self-Bounce. These are just cards that are, Beza is just absolutely amazing creature in a lot of these aggro strategies. You get to make a ton of bodies, you gain some life, and a 4-5 is really hard for a lot of decks to beat through, even if they are playing Monstrous Rage. And lastly here, we have like Orzhov midrange, and then there's also Mono Black midrange. These are pretty interesting. We see Cecil Dark Knight, that is a new card from the Final Fantasy set, which is pretty cool there. Orzhov midrange looks like it's doing the Bloodletter plus Unstoppable Slasher, where you just one-shot your opponent because they lose half their life total from getting hit with the Slasher. And if there's a Bloodletter in play, then they end up losing twice that much life. So for those of you that might be the math majors out there, if you lose half your life and then double it, you end up losing all your life. Pretty simple math, and it's it's a deck that came in on turn 4. That's pretty fast, all things considered. And of course, Bloodletter is also just a very decent card when you are playing this kind of, able to take chunks out of your opponent's life total. They are going to end up losing additional life there as well. So definitely really neat there. That's what the metagames look like over the last 30 days. And it looks a little different if you go over the last 7 days, because it's just completely flipped here. Is It Prowess is a deck that we'd seen at the top of the metagame, sharing very closely with Mono Red Aggro. Mono Red Aggro has taken the ball and absolutely just run off with it just in the past week, being almost 30% of the metagame. Azorius Omniscience and Dimir midrange actually taking over the second and third spot, leaving Prowess in 4th. We have Zur creeping up to the 5th spot. Mono Black midrange seeing some more play here. Gogori midrange showing up. Of course, they have some nice tools with things like Maelstrom Pulse, being able to deal with multiple permanents of the same name, so you can kind of like blowing out those multi Quarry Steel draws. Of course, that's probably why we see a lot of these Is It Prowess decks and these other blue decks going back to this town ain't big enough, just because you can bounce the affected permanent and your opponent's not going to be able to destroy any of them. Orzhov Self-Bounce actually kind of taking a little bit of a step back. Azorius Control being the only control deck, quote-unquote, in the top 10 here. And then Gruul Aggro actually showing up, which I think is kind of like a response to just getting to play some other cards that kind of blank the removal. We're not seeing a lot of the, nowhere to runs that we had seen before, where playing green just felt kind of pointless because a lot of players were just playing an enchantment that was going to kill a lot of their creatures while also making sure that their protection spells were essentially going to be worthless because they were going to be able to target it regardless if it got hexproof or had ward, whatever the case may be. But we see Gruul aggro kind of creeping up here in play. And again, that makes a lot of sense because Dimir Midrange seems to be the only deck that's probably playing that seems to only be playing Nowhere to Run, mono black midrange potentially there as well. But obviously when they just get to, do it once is kind of okay. The fact that, like Dimir midrange to a point, and a lot of these self-bounce decks just got to do it over and over again. That doing it once is probably like okay. And of course, there's some really good green cards there as well in Gruul aggro that you also get as far as like the sideboard to kind of deal with a lot of the other matchups as well. Where Gruul aggro seems to be like not necessarily the worst choice in terms of playing an aggro deck, but it's definitely not anywhere near the best aggro deck. So this here is pretty interesting. Players seem to be pulling away from Izzet Prowess and focusing more on just being a super aggressive aggro deck here, while Azorius Omniscience does have a lot of nice tools to kind of deal with the mono red aggro decks, and that's where I'm not necessarily surprised that the deck playing Temporary Lockdown that is not playing against the blue aggro deck is going to kind of have a lot of success there. That doesn't mean mono red aggro can't necessarily beat Azorius Omniscience or can't beat Temporary Lockdown. I'm just saying that it does get a lot harder when, the Izzet Prowess players are able to reset your own reset your own Temporary Lockdown when you don't want them to, and then just deal massive amounts of damage when they're finally locked out from underneath of it. On top of the same thing being for this time, or not this time big enough for High Noons, where you just use your one spell for that turn to bounce it to your opponent's hand on their end step. You untap with like 4, 5, 6, 7 mana in play, and you just get to go crazy with spells, get in for a bunch of damage, either kill your opponent or you put them to like a very low life total and they need a bunch of different answers, or it's like, okay, sure, like you can temporary lockdown again, but I got a grip full of cards, and there's a good chance that I have like Burst Lightning or just some kind of haste threat that I can play out and end up actually killing you with. So definitely some like posturing that's going to be taking place here in this metagame, where Izzet Prowess is definitely has dropped down from its almost 20% over the last month, but still has a pretty sizable representation over the last week, and is a deck that I assume players kind of gravitate towards because it's just a 2-color deck that is going to be able to answer a lot of the white cards that are just very hateful to that style of deck, where mono red aggro can be some of the other white cards, where it doesn't necessarily need to cast like, one spell a turn is totally fine because there's a lot of like other onboard triggers that it can use to kind of push through damage. And of course, Monstrous Rage, even if you're only able to cast it once, or, only able to cast one spell, is still going to get in tons and tons of damage when you factor in the mouse package being still one of the best aggressive tools available to players in the standard format. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this all kind of plays out. My predictions kind of for this metagame is I still think that Izzet Prowess is probably going to be, in the top 2. I highly doubt that Omniscience is going to be, the second most played deck. I think it's going to be third. I think it's very clearly it has shown that over the long run that even though there is like one of the best decks in the format does have answers for, High Noon so they can start casting multiple spells again in a turn, for Temporary Lockdown so they can kind of get back some of the permanents that they end up losing, even though they make a lot of token permanents, they are going to get back the permanents that do make those tokens and potentially even, kind of punish you for tapping out for something like Temporary Lockdown by just getting rid of it and then going off and casting a bunch of spells, dealing a bunch of damage, and saying, okay, you can spend your turn again playing Temporary Lockdown. I'm going to be able to either do this all over again, or I'm just going to be able to rebuild and just kill you anyway. So I kind of see Izzet Prowess being one of like the top 2 decks in the format. Mono red aggro is probably also going to be there. So it's really going to be how do players build these aggro decks in mind, knowing that there's going to be plenty of other players playing like these aggro strategies, whether it's going to be just straight red or it's going to be blue red, or maybe even this green red strategy here, given the fact that, Izzet Prowess and mono red aggro are going to be trying to either bounce/kill a lot of your threats, and they're not going to have a way to get around hexproof or ward a lot of the time. So maybe even a Gruul aggro strategy where they're going to be kind of full in on doing the mice thing, and then of course trying to Monstrous Rage, deal tons of damage, and kind of blow you out by nullifying your removal spell or whatever, and then just kind of continuing to apply massive amounts of pressure, because that is going to be something that is super difficult to deal with. But there's also going to be this tension between the other like white decks of the format, where they're going to be playing temporary lockdowns, they're going to be playing high noons, they're going to be playing authority of the consoles, where, you know, what exactly is going to happen from here. And that's going to be the big thing. And honestly, I would not be surprised if, you know, 4-color Zur is towards like the bottom of the metagame here. Of course, I think that a deck that can just gain a ton of life out of nowhere and, of course, get a ton of value from just playing these cheap things are going to be really nice. Of the Beanstalk is still a very, very, very good card, as it turns out. I just think that it might be a little too slow when you have mono red aggro that's trying to race Izzet Prowess, and you have Izzet Prowess trying to figure out, like, is it trying to be an aggro deck, or is it trying to be a mid-range deck, or is it trying to border on that control, you know, aspect and try to maybe potentially go bigger than something like Dimir mid-range, or try to play like this grindy-ish game with Azorius Omniscience and trying to nullify a lot of their removal. I think that's a lot of what the metagame is going to kind of center itself around. And kind of what we went over and a short that we posted, you know, is exactly like, how is aggro going to stack up in this metagame? It seems like it is going to be by far the most represented like macro archetype. Mono red is more than likely going to be the most played, if not the second most played. And I would imagine Izzet Prowess is going to take the other spot. What kind of innovations players are going to come up with? Izzet Prowess is going to have the most eyes on it, because again, it has been considered the best deck for a while in standard, and is a deck that has probably the most room to innovate, where mono red aggro has had very little to no innovation, I would say, in terms of, you know, again, maybe shuffling the numbers around and maybe shuffling the number of lands that you play. You know, they did get Tersa Light Shatter from the Tarkir Dragonstorm set, and they've also gotten probably, I'm sure, something from Final Fantasy, but really a lot of the core game plan is still the same, where Izzet Prowess has kind of been this evolving and rotating door of just kind of innovation and different things that players are going for. And that's really kind of the point that we're going to drive home here with this potential standard metagame, is that Izzet Prowess it's kind of the ball is in their court, basically. And it seems like there's been a lot of players that have, you know, been registering, you know, cards like Corey Steelcutter that want to register VV, where there's something there, obviously, and players are just going to kind of gravitate towards that and do that to try to create some value and kind of get ahead on things. And it's going to be interesting to see, you know, what ends up happening here. And yeah, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the white cards this weekend. Again, Authority of the Consoles, Temporary Lockdown, and High Noon are all going to be in high demand, no pun intended, and they're definitely going to have to put in some work in a metagame where there's a lot of white cards. Of course, potentially decks that are just playing Rats also are going to be very helpful. Less so against like the mono red aggro decks, more so probably against Izzet Prowess. So, and even like Dimir midrange, you're going to be able to clean up a lot of converted mana cost of things with a 4-mana board wipe. Potentially also seeing Ultima as well, which is probably one of my favorite board wipes, I would say, of all time. But, you know, that's just me. So it's going to be interesting to see how this metagame kind of breaks down. Ultimately, I think Izzet Prowess is going to have a great showing here. We're going to have a lot of the best players in the world who have been working on this deck for, I'm assuming, in the better part of at least a few weeks to a month, at minimum, trying to figure out, you know, how some of these new Final Fantasy cards are going to fit into it. Of course, it probably got arguably one of the best cards from the Final Fantasy set that isn't necessarily multi-format all-star level yet, but very simply a very powerful card that a lot of players are playing with across multiple formats, on top of, you know, having to fight with mono red aggro, which seemed to be kind of the deck to dethrone a lot of these other more complicated strategies in the format. So it's going to be very interesting to see how kind of all this stuff plays out. And yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what you're excited for Pro Tour Final Fantasy. Of course, subscribe to the channel, all that fun stuff, and check out the description if you want even more content from me. But that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.